Yeah, there we go. Hello, hello, hello. All right. It always helps to hit the go live button. um, yes, you probably see me now, I'm guessing. Um, well, good. I've just done a whole bunch of talking for no reason. Better late than never. I will learn this software sooner or later. Welcome, and time to jump in and do a little bit of talking about Tater. Cheers. Cheers to everybody. Yes, and feel free to start putting your comments down. I will be watching that throughout. I'm running this show by myself, so I will grab things as I can. Jonathan, welcome. Glad to have you here. Thanks to everybody who has purchased the book up to this point. If you're curious about the book, hopefully this presentation here will give you kind of an idea of what you can expect out of the book. I've lined some whiskeys up back here. I have one in my glass. I hope you have one in your glass as well. And tell me what you're drinking if you are having a sip tonight. I am actually drinking the Riverset Rye barrel proof because it's just a really, really nice licoricey kind of rye, which I dig. Um, so a couple of things here. One of the special things I'm going to do for you, I actually ran through and found some of the old newspaper clippings that I used to research this book. And if you haven't held it yet, it's a heavy one. It's 500 pages almost, and 800 footnotes in the back. And as you go through the footnotes, you're going to see I did a lot of newspaper research for this, going all the way back into the 1700s and 1800s, and I really stripped away any kind of modern books. The reason that I did that is because a lot of the narrative written around Tennessee whiskey is from a Kentucky bourbon perspective. So I wanted to strip that away, or it's Jack Daniel's history, maybe a little George Dickel history, and then, we don't really get much more beyond that. So I wanted to get back to the heart of Tennessee whiskey and really get to know what was going on pre-prohibition, and then I continued on. It's a little easier to find information moving forward after that once you get past prohibition, and found some fascinating stories. I'm going to show you a couple of resources that I used. There's a character, I call them characters because I write stories, but there's a man named Robert Renfro. He's a fascinating character. This book is interesting because, like the Jack Daniel's Legacy book, these are fictionalized versions. I call them kind of, they're historical fiction, but they're based in some reality. And so it's like you can't really use these 100% for your research, but you can kind of hope you can figure out from some of the facts that or the few facts that you find in those, be able to put together a story. And I will say that the Jack Daniel's story was the hardest one for me to write. And it's because when I did my Whiskey Lore Stories episode, I used that particular book, Legacy, to do the writing. And if you go back and you listen to it now, and then you read this book and read my chapter, you'll be like, these don't match up. What's going on? They do, but they don't, because there are certain facts that I know from going to the archives are true. They're just all out of time. And so we'll walk through some of those actually when I pull up my newspaper items there. Also, there's some other books I used that were modern, actually, beyond all the older ones that I used. This was a big influence on me because she talks about the Virginia City saloons and goes into the Old West saloons. And Tennessee was basically the Old West in the 1810s and 1820s. So we're kind of getting a feel for that. And I do write a lot about the taverns and saloons, and you get a feel for that culture as well. I go into the Scots Irish. This book actually was something I read a long time ago, and I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. I would like to trace what was going on with the Scots Irish and see if they actually did have an influence on the Tennessee whiskey industry, which, spoiler, well, this isn't a spoiler actually, because I don't really say it in the book, but they don't really actually have anything to do with the Tennessee whiskey industry. They were much more involved in moonshine up in the hills. And there were a few people who had, it's funny, the one guy that I cover who's Scots Irish, besides Andrew Jackson, who did own a distillery, is James Robertson, and he was a teetotaler, but he was Scots Irish. But he was the first one to have a prohibition in the state of Tennessee. So it's kind of the opposite of what we would expect. So fun stuff there, and it's been quite a journey actually to get to this point where now I actually get to talk about this book instead of having it all stuck up in my head. So right now, I actually have a launch team that has helped me put a lot of this, get this book launched. Why you call them a launch team? And so they've been putting reviews up on after reading the book and getting some ideas. So I'm going to do a little prep actually for them, because I know some of them are watching this video today, and that they have to get in there and start writing some reviews. And so I wrote notes the other day and kind of put down, here are kind of the things that I was trying to achieve with this particular book. First of all, I wanted to tell the story of Tennessee whiskey because I started doing my travels into Tennessee about 3 years ago. And as I did, I was like, nobody here knows anything about anything except for Jack Daniels. Every time I go to a distillery, they're telling me the history of Jack Daniels, and I'm going, there's got to be more history than that. And so I wanted to dig in, and I was anticipating writing about a 150-page book because I didn't think there was going to be that much. And then I found out there's actually 250 years worth of history. So that was a mind blower right off the bat. And then I ended up with 600 pages worth of notes. And I said, I don't know how I'm going to put this all into a book, because I'm going to try to craft stories out of this and make it entertaining instead of just sitting here throwing a bunch of facts out. So I had to really work to get this down. And actually, I cut some stories out. And the stories that I cut out actually will probably show up very soon as Whiskey Lore Stories episodes, because they're great stories, but it was just like, this is going to be an 800-page book if I don't tame this thing down a little bit. So, but I wanted it to be something that could be a foundation going forward also for history research on Tennessee whiskey, because as I said, nobody has written this 250-year-old history from beginning to the present. And so I'm trying to give a foundation to work off of. That's why there's so many footnotes in this book. I also wanted people to understand Tennessee and its origins, because when you're trying to name who the first distiller is in Tennessee history, and then all of a sudden you're going, well, it wasn't Tennessee then. Understanding how the state came together. And what was interesting is, as I started doing that, I started realizing that there were other stories that really had not been told before, such as the Cherokee story. You're not going to actually find a whiskey book that talks about the Cherokee and kind of works them in. I do, and the reason that I do is because if we're talking about the eastern mountains of Tennessee, and actually in the entire state, you are talking about tribes that had influence, and they keep showing up. If we're going to tell a story from one side, you're just going to see people being attacked, and you're going to go, okay, they're just being attacked, and we're going with the old narratives. Whereas now I've kind of opened this up and said, hey, here's their history as well, so that you can understand why the conflict was going on and why these distillers were having their distilleries burned down and all of that sort of stuff. So, like I say, this will be a completely different take on whiskey history in that aspect. And then as I started going through, it was like, there's not a lot of detail on the distillers themselves and what they were distilling. But the tavern culture was fascinating, and it ties in because they were making whiskey so that they could barter for into the mercantiles. And then you had this whiskey culture that was developing out. And so I kind of dive into all of that as well and talk about the evolution before we get to an actual whiskey industry. And then I was reading this the other day, and it's so funny because I was reading this the other day because I typed in Lost History of Tennessee Whiskey on Google, and I started finding some articles. And as I was reading them, they were going, Jack Daniel and Uncle Nearest are the beginning of Tennessee whiskey. And I'm going, you have just thrown away 100 years of history prior to that if you think that's where all of this started. And so it takes 13 chapters before you finally get to Jack Daniel and Uncle Nearest. Now, I'm going to go into that a little bit as well because I tried to tell those stories as accurately as I could. Let me do a screen share here, actually, and hopefully you get to see this. Let's see. Oh, there it is. Share screen and window. Entire screen. That works. All right. Yeah, here we go. Hopefully this is going to show you what I want it to. Maybe. All right. I think it is actually this one, but I will adjust as needed. Okay. Oh, that's good. All right. So I'm going to move that over here. And let's see. I need to see if I can still see your chat. Yep. There your chat's there. So feel free to chime in at any time if you wish. But these are some of the things that I had to kind of work through in terms of newspapers and trying to figure out the history by looking at what people were writing about and how things were being branded and all that sort of stuff. So this is one of the first where you're going to see the terms Lincoln and Robertson County whiskeys along with bourbon and rye whiskey. So in Tennessee, there were two styles that I go deeply into, and these started pre-Civil War, Lincoln County style and the Robertson County style. So when you hear people say Old Bourbon, well, they also talked about Old Lincoln and Old Robertson. So I dive a lot into that history as well. These are in no particular order, but this is interesting to me because we see Bell of Bourbon here, and you really don't start getting pictures and illustrations in these newspapers until probably around 1880 or so, and then you'll start seeing this kind of stuff in here. One of the hardest things that I had to overcome was actually learning the terminology of whiskeys back then. You will see here that they talk about we only use the flinty or harmony part of the grain, thus freeing it of fusel oils before it is distilled. So if you ever hear about the charcoal mellowing process that Jack Daniels uses, that Tennessee whiskey is famous for, they call it the Lincoln County process, then that is actually to run that whiskey through before it goes in the barrel to get rid of these, what they call fusel oils, which back then they said those are the headache causing oils and also the harsher flavors that are being taken out. So in Tennessee, they felt it was better actually not to put it in the barrel, but instead to just run it through sugar maple charcoal. It didn't have to be a color. You just wanted to drink a whiskey that wasn't going to give you a headache and that was somewhat smooth to drink. And so that is kind of the idea that you're running into here when they're talking about getting the fusel oils out. Now, this is a bourbon. Today, we know bourbon's rules would say that you're going to not have charcoal mellowing as a de facto thing. You can make bourbon and charcoal mellow it, as George Dickel has proven here recently. But anyway, it's just interesting. This ad actually is out of Louisville, Kentucky. So, but oh well. Actually, Kelly and Davenport was part of the reason why I put this, got this clipping, because they were a wholesaler in Chattanooga, and Kelly. There is a whiskey out now. There's some whiskeys out under the J.W. Kelly name, and I've actually had them on the podcast before too. And very interesting diving into their history because Like a lot of different people like Jack Daniel, they point to the 1866 date as their inception of their distillery, when in reality, neither of them had a distillery at that time. Kelly just actually got into the business world in Chattanooga in 1866, so that's why he used that particular date. Um, any fans of Kentucky Peerless whiskey out there? This was an interesting one that I bumped into. We were talking about J.W. Kelly. Well, Carl White, after J.W. Kelly passed away, was the president of that company. And fascinating to bump into this article all of a sudden, because I have been to Kentucky Peerless and had no idea that J.W. Kelly at one time bought half of that distillery. So what that turned into was, if you go into the Kentucky Peerless Distillery in Louisville, Kentucky, you'll see this picture of that distillery on their wall, but it says nothing about J.W. Kelly. It only talks about Kentucky Peerless. Yet this, since they owned half of it, they made quadruple A Lincoln County whiskey there, which I think is absolutely bizarre and interesting all at once, because Lincoln County is a Tennessee county, yet somehow it has ended up on a whiskey that is being made in Kentucky. And this is interesting because this is from around 1910. And nowadays, we just take for granted that bourbon is made anywhere in the United States, but bourbon is the name of a Kentucky county. And so it's kind of that odd thing that I see when I'm looking at a bottle of Tennessee bourbon now, and I go, Tennessee bourbon. Why does it have the name of a Kentucky county on this Tennessee product? And so it's going to be interesting to see, the longer this book is out there, what people's reaction is going to be, and whether some distillers actually go, you know what, maybe we shouldn't be making Tennessee bourbon. We should make an effort to make Tennessee whiskey, even if we just run it through 3 pieces of sugar maple charcoal to be able to designate it that way. James, welcome. Thank you for joining from across the pond. I know it's late for you. It's hard to schedule these things. I figured I was safer with Tennessee whiskey, that everybody wouldn't be bleary-eyed watching this. So, all right. So some other things I bumped into during my research through this. This is from May of 1938. Now, in a nutshell, the story of Tennessee Prohibition is that Tennessee went into Prohibition 10 years before the rest of the country did. And there was a huge event that happened that caused that I go deeply into. And then once we get out of that and everybody's set free to, make whiskey, or the national government repeal, well, not so fast. Tennessee is still under a bone dry law, and they have to have that repealed. And so it's very interesting to note, and I go deeply into it. Lem Motlow is the nephew of Jack Daniel, and he took over the distillery after Jack. And he was the one that helped bring Tennessee whiskey back after Prohibition. So Lem goes through this intense fight to get himself back to a point where he can start distilling Jack Daniel's whiskey again. And he finally gets to a point where he's got all the hurdles cleared, all the legal stuff is done, it's gone to the state Supreme Court, and so now it's going to a vote in Moore County, and all they have to do is vote, a majority voting to open him back up. And as I was doing the research for this, I'm looking for Motlow, and I'm doing searches on Motlow, and I come up with this, and this was 2 days before the vote. And this is Felix Motlow, who is Lem Motlow's brother. Now, Lem has gone through everything to try to get this, and he has fought the temperance people, and he's fought the state, and he's fought electioneers that are like, we're not going to help you out. We don't care what the law is. And now he's got the state Supreme Court saying, you have to do this. Okay. You have to let the people vote on this. And next thing you know, Lem's brother Felix comes out and writes this letter to the Nashville Tennessean and says, my brother, I know he helped me out and other things, but he's ruining the family by bringing whiskey into and associating it with our name. And big, long letter. And it's like, are you kidding? This guy has fought tooth and nail to bring whiskey back to Tennessee, and he is this close. And then you're going to do something like this. So it's an interesting read, actually. And I was going to put some of it into the book, actually. But I think overall, you kind of get the gist of it. I may post it out on Patreon at some point because it is an interesting read. It's trying to be nice, but at the same time, it's kind of like, no, I don't care what you're into. I'm going to stop you from getting your whiskey distillery. So this was one of the first ads that came out after whiskey was approved in Tennessee, and Jack Daniel's was the only whiskey in Tennessee at that particular point. And you'll notice that nowhere on the bottle it's very interesting. I found an article by historian Michael Veach. He just wrote it the other day about why people are now starting to call Jack Daniel's bourbon and why that's coming up as a thing. And so we got into this discussion, or I saw this discussion about how even back in the day, Jack Daniel's was not called Tennessee whiskey. And here's your proof. When they came out with this bottle, nowhere does it say Tennessee whiskey. It just says Jack Daniel's Old Time Distillery, number 7. And so very interesting. But little bits that you see here, that they made apple brandy at one time. They made a pear brandy and corn whiskey on top of that. And in these early days, they actually used to age in smaller barrels, and they only aged it for 2 years or less. They actually started with a 6-month whiskey. And Lem said, because we run it through the sugar maple charcoal, I would put it up against any of the 2 to 3 year stuff up in Kentucky. So it was really interesting to see him brag on the charcoal mellowing process, because through my research in the 19th century, it is really interesting to see how passionate they really were about that being one of the differences to how they made whiskey. Now, this is an ad for George Dickel, and the reason I put this one here was, first of all, to show you that at one time, George Dickel was a blend, and there was another, at a later date, it became a Kentucky straight bourbon. And so you go, Kentucky, wait a second. Well, Prohibition sent them over the border, and it was made at the Stitzel Weller Distillery, where Pappy Van Winkle was working at the time. It was made at the George T. Stagg Distillery, which is today's Buffalo Trace Distillery, and it was made at James E. Pepper Distillery in Lexington. And so this is an ad from when it actually was made at the Lexington Distillery. So again, this is where my eyeballs go to when I'm going through these ads. I'm looking for little things that are clues that kind of help me figure out how to put these stories together, because there really was no guidance for me other than to jump through all of these newspaper ads. So this will show you where advertising is in terms of truth in advertising, I guess, is really a modern concept, because back then, this is 1941, and they're saying 71 years. We have 71 years of Great Cascade whiskey. Well, not really, because the Cascade name didn't really come around until about 50 years or 49 years before that. But they seem to have tacked these extra years on out of thin air somehow. And so I think this is, let me do the math. So I think maybe this is where they get the 1870 date from, but 1870 on the bottles of George Dickel, which, you can't see me at the moment, but On the current bottles, it says 1870. That date doesn't have any bearing in the world as far as I can. There's nothing associated with George Dickel that I can find that happened in 1870 that would signify putting that particular date on the bottle. Um, all right, let's see. I'm reading James' message down there. Uh, nice. Yeah, it's interesting to see these barrels that make it overseas, and he's saying basically that they get barrels from Tennessee, but they don't know where they come from. Dickel is really a great guess for that because um, I have a whiskey, and I was just tasting it actually a little earlier today from Bard Distillery in Western Kentucky, and it's called Cinder and Smoke, and it's a 13-year-old whiskey. When I bought it, it's 13. They now have a 17-year-old version of it, and it says distilled in Tennessee, but it doesn't say where it's distilled. Well, a lot of whiskeys like we hear Uncle Nearest. Where does that come from? Because they just built the distillery. So it came from somewhere else. Where did it come from? It was distilled in Tennessee, and there's only a few choices there that it could come from. And so you make the guess that, well, some of it's probably coming from Dickel. Some may come from Tennessee Distilling, which is in Columbia, which does a lot of sourced whiskey for Tennessee. Um, you know, so but Dickel, I think, does non-disclosure agreements, so the people who are making it can't really, or bringing those barrels in, really can't say where it came from. So usually when you hit that dead end, you can kind of guess that it's George Dickel. But it also could be that there are a lot of distilleries now in Tennessee, and that maybe there's just a pool of barrels that are coming over from some of the smaller distilleries as well. But I have seen Nelson's Greenbrier barrels in Ireland and in a distillery, and I have seen Jack Daniels all over the place. But I don't think I've ever seen one that has George Dickel stamped on it. So that's probably a good guess that is a Dickel barrel. This is something I'd love to find. Let's see if I can get that out of the way. Yes. At one point they were this was during the age of doing decanters. And so they had this horn. You could actually get a horn filled with George Dickel whiskey. And this was when, and this picture, I don't know who this is, but they're trying to make it out to be like that is George Dickel. Maybe he looks something like that. But yeah, it's really interesting because this is where in 1965, they were really starting to build the story of Stubborn George. And I wrote, actually, if you follow me on Instagram, I did a question yesterday, and I think it threw a lot of people. It was, which of these four people never owned a distillery? And I had Andrew Jackson, Davy Crockett, Charles Nelson, and George Dickel. Well, a lot of people guessed that it was Davy Crockett. But Davy Crockett did have a distillery, and I talk about it in the book. Andrew Jackson had a distillery. I talk about it in the book. Charles Nelson definitely had a distillery. He had 3 distilleries. And so I talk about those in the book. George Dickel never owned a distillery. This was the last thing that I was really trying to nail down the last time I went to Tennessee. I went to Coffee County, where the distillery is, and I started going through the records because I hear people say, oh, well, in 1888, Victor Schwab, who was the president of George A. Dickel and Company, went and bought the distillery. And so the connection is made there. Oh, George Dickel bought the distillery, but he didn't. Victor Schwab bought the distillery. So he was a man running 2 different companies. And of course, he's going to funnel his whiskey from the from the Cascade Hollow Distillery to George Dickel, which is a wholesale company in Nashville, but he never owned the distillery. So George Dickel never owned the distillery, and actually was in pretty poor health during the time when the distillery was owned by Schwab. So he wasn't making a lot of decisions at that particular point. So it's really interesting that his name got attached to this whiskey brand. And my speculation on that was basically they were selling it at George Dickel's warehouse wholesale, so they kept his name on, but they called it George A. Dickel's Cascade whiskey. And the Cascade was, hey, without George's name on it, we are now getting a new brand associated. Because George was a pretty well-known person uh, at that time. He made the front page of the newspaper when he passed away. He's the only one that I saw. Jack Daniels got on the front page of the Nashville Banner newspaper when he died, but it was like this little column uh, and just a title, no picture. Whereas on George Dickel, he got a big spread on the front page when he passed away. So, interesting bit of history there. This was something else I had to dig through, and you might find this very interesting as I'm going through. All right, so let's see which one is okay. So there's Nathan Green. So this is the 1870 census. Now this is the challenge that Fawn Weaver has in trying to research Nearest Green, and the challenge I have in trying to research Nearest Green. When you go through, he is in the record in 1870. So this would have been the first census he would have been on that wasn't a slave census. And so here we see Nathan Green, and we see that he is 27 years old. Now, this throws everything off, right, in terms of trying to figure out when he was, these dates that we have. Because if you think about it, 27, all right, so 1870, 60, 50, 40, so that means he was born in 1843, which doesn't match with the 1820 date. But hang on. All right, now he's a farmer, and this happens a lot when you're going through the census. Jack Daniel is listed as a farmer because he owned a farm, and it wasn't always distilling. If you were a distiller, that wasn't always the thing that you would necessarily put down when the census worker came by. Now you see the rest of his family here as well. Now this is another thing that the legacy book goes into, okay, that says Jack was hanging out with George Green, that they were like best buddies. Well, they probably were best buddies at some point, and because they're sitting next to each other in that famous picture at the distillery. But George is 7 years old in 1870. So that means he was born in 1863, and Jack would have already been, by that time, he was 14. So 7 years are born and 14. So now Jack's 21, George is 7. And so I can see their relationship growing after that, but them playing together and being the same age, these are the things you start bumping into going, okay, this is you know, the story's great, but the dates are just off. That's the main thing I bump into. Now, keep in mind that Nathan here is 27 and his wife is 25. Now, in the next census, we go to 1880, just 10 years. Now we get, where is he? He's here somewhere. Green. Yep, there he is. Now he's Nearest Green. And he's 60? Is that right? Is he 60? Let's look closely at that. Is that 60? Because that would make it 1820. But I don't see a loop on that. It's on the line. Doesn't necessarily look like a 4 because he does a hard curve on the 4, and I don't see the stem coming down. But it's like, this is what you got to look at and go, okay, I don't know. And actually he's shown as born in Maryland on the other census, and on this one, he's born in Tennessee. So again, I really wanted to trust the census as I was going through this, but it is just a mess to try to piece these things together when they weren't really as accurate. You figure what's going on is that neighbor is coming by, because at a certain point it was actually people in the community that were going out and doing their own community census, and so they're probably just guessing, so and so's not home, and so I'll just write down such and such, And so it feels that way because even Jack Daniel, when you go through his, um, there's a year in there that's just so far off. You're like, okay, nobody asked him. So yeah, it's crazy. All right. This was interesting. This charter. Hey, Todd, glad to have you aboard. Um, so we're kind of rolling through some of the newspaper clippings that I came across. I got an old crow one coming up for you here in a minute, by the way. Um, so this is one that I bumped into the other day, and this is why I say with this history research, stay tuned to patreon.com/whiskey lore, because as I find new stuff, I'm going to put it out there. And this is one of those things where just like a week ago, I come up with this thing that says, charter for distillery for Lem Motlow. So this goes through and says, when he actually rechartered the distillery with the state. And then that got me thinking, oh, let me reach out to the state and see if I can get a certificate. Well, come to find out, there was another distillery that chartered right after him in Chattanooga. And I did put it in the book. It was like, that was one of my last edits. It was like, oh, okay, wait a second. My story was going that there was, there was Jack Daniel after Prohibition, then there was George Dickel, and then what was that third one going to be? And I go through a list of different distilleries that tried to become that third distillery after those two, and also how Lincoln County, why did Lincoln County have the right to distill, but they didn't have a distillery for the longest time? So I go into all of that stuff. And then I go into the trouble that Chattanooga had getting their distillery set up, the modern one, because the city law wouldn't let you, or the county law wouldn't let them distill. And then all of a sudden I find this thing that says, oh, interesting. Somebody in 1938 actually tried to get a distillery going there. And interestingly enough, they were going to put it into a particular neighborhood. And I didn't put this part in, but apparently they were getting threats from the KKK saying you can't put a distillery in here, and or someone will be in pain, basically. And so I was like, wow, okay, that's really interesting. And it was just basically because they didn't want whiskey in their neighborhood. And that's one of the things I do cover in the book, was that it was really interesting during Tennessee Prohibition, the first fight in 1887, that there was a push to try to get the black vote to vote for Prohibition, but probably wasn't going to happen because the KKK was very pro Prohibition at that time. So little interesting things you bump into. I will say one of the things I had to do during this research was contact my friend Alan Bishop from Spirits of French Lick, because Alan knows a lot more of the technical side than I do. And I'm reading this stuff and I'm going, yields this, yields that, fermenting period, sweet mash, 48 hours, 72 hours, sour mash. I don't get it. So he and I were on the phone chatting back and forth over all of this stuff. And it was great because I was telling him stuff and I was like, look what I found. And he's going, wow, okay, that answers a lot of questions for me. And so he was one of the people that I actually had read the book ahead of time, just I really wanted to get his impression of it, but I also wanted him to catch if anything I said was kind of off base. So technically this book should also be accurate as well. And I definitely learned a lot, because you'll see the word sweet mash here. There is a modern definition for what sweet mash is. That is not what they were thinking sweet mash was back in those days. Now this is, for anybody who has followed bourbon history, you will probably have heard of bourbon was first mentioned in 1821. And they'll talk about it being at Limestone Landing, which is Maysville, current Maysville, but it was known as Limestone Landing at one point. That comes from the Western Citizen newspaper. The Western Citizen newspaper was not from Maysville. It was actually from Paris, Kentucky, which is in Bourbon County. And so they were talking about bourbon whiskey, selling bourbon whiskey in 1821. So I was going back and trying to find the first time I could find a mention of Tennessee whiskey, and that happened to be in a Charleston, South Carolina newspaper in 1824. And here you see it right here. Very interesting to see, what they're selling: German steel and kegs of nails. And this is the thing, you'll look down here and you'll see BBLS, Old Tennessee Whiskey. And so that's something else you got to kind of learn is, okay, wait a second, what does that? Oh, beer barrels. Okay, so they weren't selling in casks, they were selling in beer barrels. So, but you also have to learn that they were using barrels for a lot more than just whiskey back then. They shipped everything in barrels back then, including foodstuffs and you name it. But anyway, I thought that was really interesting. I did also a nationwide search to see the first time Old Monongahela rye was mentioned, and it happened to be in Tennessee, actually. So I mentioned that in the book as well. This is something else that I think is really interesting that I cover a little bit in the book about the fact that this is an ad from California, and you will see that the price of Jack Daniels is a wee bit higher than everybody else. And these are, good quality whiskeys down through here. And yet, Jack Daniels is a bit higher in price. This was something that really surprised me because the narrative has been that Scotch whiskey and bourbon went through this depression because of vodka. And that happened from the 1960s, late 1960s, into the 1970s, and then definitely in the 1980s. Yet, Tennessee whiskey, you could not keep it on the shelf. It was allocated. Jack Daniels was impossible to find. They didn't make enough of it, was part of the problem. And so Jack Daniels was actually highly prized throughout the 70s and 80s. They couldn't make enough of the stuff to be able to keep up with demand. And very interesting that George Dickel actually said, Ralph Dupes, the man who was in charge of George Dickel and a big promoter of George Dickel, he actually had to admit, he said, this Jack Daniels phenomenon is just incredible, hard to believe. But he said, we're actually having a hard time keeping whiskey in as well. So it was just something about Tennessee whiskey at that time period was still kind of standing above everything else in terms of brown spirits during that time. So James is asking, so what age would you guess Old Tennessee whiskey, months or years? So are you kind of talking about 19th century and what the standard would have been for Tennessee whiskey? Because that's it's an interesting question, because actually prior to the Civil War and actually prior to the excise tax, Tennessee, I don't think they even cared about a barrel. I think that's what made Tennessee whiskey different, was that they ran it through that sugar maple charcoal, and that was enough. It was taking out what needed to be taken out, and it was refining the spirit and making it better. And the only reason they started putting it in barrels after was, and the beer barrels. Very interesting, because I think this goes to that same point. They didn't really care. It was like a vessel to put it in. And this was something interesting that I found in my research also. And thanks, I will say, to Andrew, well, I can't show you again, but Andrew Bromberg in his book on Texas whiskey, because he brought this up as well. It used to be at that time period that they would tell you how to clean your barrel out so that it had no impact on the flavor of your whiskey. They thought it was actually a deterrent to let the barrel have any influence. So it was, let's get this thing basically sterilized and cleaned out as much as we can. No char, none of that. We just want this barrel to be a vessel to move the spirit around in. So it's really interesting to see that, and that after Prohibition, well, after the Civil War, when the Excise Act came about in 1868, that's when they said you can have 1 year in a warehouse with a barrel, and you can save taxes for that 1 year. And so Tennessee started aging their whiskey, and this is the reason why Tennessee whiskey, they mellow it before it goes in the barrel, whereas a lot of like Evan Williams and the rest do it after. It's because Tennessee was like, well, this is our process. And then, oh, well, we'll throw it in the barrel and save on taxes for a little while. You had certain distillers like Old Robertson whiskey, John Woodard, who loved to age his whiskey. So he would age it 7 years, even when he was only getting a 1 year tax break on it or a 3 year tax break on it. So there were varying opinions, and so we can't just paint with a broad brush and say they all did it the same way. But most of the Tennessee distillers seemed to lean towards the mellowing and not necessarily relying so much on the barrel. But that wasn't a big factor for them. They were more worried about sweet mash versus sour mash and using the mellowing process. Um, so Todd, you're saying something about Park and Tilford Distillery. Um, I'm not sure how that fits in. Let me know. Um, okay, next thing here is the Decanali. So you've seen possibly Old Dominick whiskey, and so they were an interesting one too for me to do some research on because they have an 1866 date also, and Dominic was actually involved in selling whiskey even before 1866, but he didn't own the place. So he was working for his uncle. And then he actually did sooner or later come around to selling whiskey, but then it wasn't the earliest I could find of Old Dominic was 1903. And then what was interesting is now all of a sudden, let's look at this ad, and this is from 1913. Now, what happened in Tennessee is they went into Prohibition, and so all the distilleries and all the people who were making whiskey had to go out of the state. But because of interstate commerce laws, there was nothing that would stop them from shipping their whiskey back into Tennessee. So Tennesseans were still drinking, but it was like somebody like Decanali, which is Old Dominic, had to basically go to Helena, Arkansas, and then ship their stuff back in to Memphis. And then that was okay. You could do that. And so this is a list of all the different whiskeys that they sold, and they sold a lot of them. And it's fun to read some of these because there's bourbons in here: TB Rippey, Green River, Kentucky Club. Now there's your Old Dominick bourbon. Okay, so they were actually sourcing their whiskey out of Kentucky because they couldn't distill anything in Tennessee, and actually they never actually distilled anything. This is the other thing that I wanted to point out. It says from the largest and oldest house in the South. So everybody's got a claim to be oldest, but yet there's no. It's so far from reality. It's just that it becomes comical to read it after a while. All right. So yeah, this is a fun one. Oh, you saw? Okay, very nice. I didn't catch that. Park and Tilford was actually on one of these price lists. This would be fun to dig through and see all the different. There's a Dominicker gin, which means that they were also selling a Decanali, because the rooster was called a Dominicker, which is their mascot, and James E. Pepper, and so on and so forth. So kind of fun to look through and see all of that. Now this is from a Jackson Daily News, which is out of Jackson, Mississippi. So they were targeting Jackson, Mississippi as well during that time period. Now this is what I probably have dealt with more, wasted more time trying to read through people's writing. Now this is some of the best writing that I came across. I mean, thank you, John Overton, head of the excise, for having some form of penmanship that I can actually read, because there's so many of these old title deeds and records. It just actually, you go blind trying to read all of this stuff. But it was interesting because as I was going through some of these, it was like, we hear about the whiskey rebellion and the fact that these distillers were trying to, they didn't want to pay taxes. Well, of course, if you've heard the Whiskey Rebellion series that I did on whiskey lore, you'll know that that's not really true. They wanted to pay their taxes. They just couldn't pay in cash because they were poor farmers who bartered for everything. And so this was actually a letter that was written where he's asking Alexander Hamilton to help him with this collection because of the problem of trying to get cash out of people. So it's a very interesting angle there. I love the Tennessee State Archives. I spent a couple of days up there actually going through the books, and nothing helps dispel myths more than going through these old business directories and actually having an opportunity to see truly what business was there and what business wasn't. And so I was going through Nashville, and I was trying to find Dickel, and I'm trying to find the people who worked with Dickel, and I'm trying to find J.W. Kelly because he was there for a short period of time, and I'm trying to find Charles Nelson. And come to find out, as I'm going through Charles Nelson, I'm finding he had 3 distilleries, not just one. So we know the Nelson's Greenbrier distillery, but he was actually associated with a couple of other distilleries. And so that led me back to the newspapers, and that's where I was able to really piece this story together. So this is the fun part of this also, is that in talking to the brothers at Old Dominic and the brothers at Nelson's Greenbrier, it's like, with this wider scope that I'm going through and this wider net that I'm casting, I'm bumping into parts of their history that that they haven't covered yet, or that maybe they don't know about. And so it's been fun kind of passing information back and forth. And we'll get to one of those things here in a moment. This is a name that Woodard, that once you read this book, you'll be like, man, this family was like a dynasty of distillers, yet we know nothing about them. And they don't get mentioned at all anymore. But yet a deep, rich history. And again, putting the emphasis on the fact that Robertson County whiskey was a thing, just like bourbon was a thing. And so you start seeing a lot of that coming up through the papers. Now, this one was fun. I was actually at the Moore County Archives, and while I was there, I was looking through the Jack Daniels Motlow family papers and trying to find specific information. Well, I didn't find the information I was looking for, but I bumped into 2 things that I thought were really kind of interesting. One, I'm not showing here because you have to read it to really understand it. But apparently, Jack Daniel was having a little love letter passing back and forth with some woman that he was trying to sort of woo, and then all of a sudden she just either gave up on him or whatever, and then he kind of writes, well, I guess you're off to leave me, blah, blah, blah. And, this is just interesting to think, here's Jack Daniel. Yeah, he is a human being, and kind of here's the human side of him. But this is from 1891, and so you'll see that Jack Daniel, distiller of pure sour mash whiskey and Lincoln County whiskey. So this was the other discussion we were having about the fact that they didn't really call it Tennessee whiskey back then, mainly because Lincoln County was the thing. You wanted to designate yourself as a Lincoln County whiskey if you were in Lincoln County or you had come from Lincoln County, because that was a treasured style of whiskey, again, just like bourbon or Robertson County whiskey. And then, all right, so this was getting back to Charles Nelson. Again, I went through and I tried to find anything I could to nail down dates. So I even went into marriage records and found that Charles was married to Louisa on March 3rd, 1863. Now, I was looking for this date, but I was also looking for another date because this is why it's good to talk to the family, because as I was trying to figure this out, I was talking to Charlie Nelson, And as we were chatting back and forth, he said, "Now you know that Charles was married twice." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yes, he was married to a Louise, and then he was married to a Louisa." And I went, "Oh, I thought they were the same person." Well, come to find out, they weren't. But this was the hard part about writing this book, and this is one of those things where you have to kind of make a decision about if I'm going to make this truthful. But I actually scrubbed a line out of the book and then I put it back in. The line I scrubbed out of the book was to say that um, that Charles married his first wife, because I cannot find a marriage certificate anywhere. I cannot find a record of their marriage anywhere, and it would have been in Cincinnati, Ohio. Might have been in New York City, but most likely it was in Cincinnati, Ohio. But I could not find his first wife. And so I'm like, okay, I know he was married because in his obituary it mentions her, and his first son, Charles Jr., was hers. And in his death records, it all says, that it mentions her, but I cannot find where they were ever married. So it was like, do I put in there that they were married or do I not put it in there? So I scrubbed it. Then I went back and said they were married. So I might be wrong on that. I don't know, but I cannot find this woman. She is an absolute mystery, Louise Bringelman. And what's interesting is that when you get a name like that stapled in your brain, there are later things I was going through where there was some squabbling going on over basically there was a situation where they were trying to increase the number of cities that could be put under prohibition in Tennessee, and the liquor interests kind of messed around with things a little bit, and Victor Schwab, who was the president of George Dickel and Company, was said to have maybe done some greasing of the palms, as it were, with the politicians, sending them whiskey and things like that. And so they called Charles Nelson's bookkeeper to the stand, and he was a Bringelman. And I'm like, oh, isn't that interesting? So maybe a brother-in-law, or who knows who he is, but there's that name Bringelman, and that's not a very common name. And so there you go. Maybe that's how that worked out. Let's see. So I think common law was, but well, I think that's more of a state by state thing. Todd's asking whether there was a common law thing back then. That really is a state by state thing. So it would have to be an Ohio record to go back and look. So this is why I say at the end of the book, I'm like, I don't care if people challenge me on this stuff. I want to find the truth. So if somebody else finds the truth, I am all for it. Let's get this thing figured out. All right. And James, yes, I am actually doing an audiobook. Thank you so much for the compliment. I am doing an audiobook. I am up to chapter 20 right now on doing that. So I'm hoping to have that out sometime, probably right around Christmas, that will come out. It's 18 hours or so long. I've done a pre-run on it already, so I know it takes a long time to put that together. So I am working on that. Okay, so this is really interesting because this is from the Chattanooga News, and this was Spoon Motlow. I don't know the exact relationship between Spoon Motlow and Lem Motlow, but he was basically running a wholesale shop in Chattanooga and also ran the business down in Alabama as well. And this is from 1908. So this is just half a month before whiskey is going to be shut down in Tennessee. And this big full-page ad is in that has the story of Lincoln County's whiskeys. And so here it says the oldest in the United States, old-time whiskey. All right. So in the book, I talk about the oldest distillery claim and kind of how that evolved, because I'm sorry, it's not true. that they are the oldest registered distillery in the United States because their first distillery number was number 7. So why would they give you number 7 if you were the first distillery? Actually, they aren't even the first in their own district. But it did evolve out of something else, and so I go through that in the book, how it sort of morphed from one idea to, oh well, we'll just say this instead, and now all of a sudden that's how it worked out. Um, because I put the date at 1875 when it was the Daniel and Call Distillery, and then it was 1877 when Jack Daniel actually went out on his own, which blows the 1866 date out. And that's where I have to get into a little bit of speculation in the book, and it'll be interesting to see how my speculation is taken. But I think it's an educated guess, and as good of an educated guess as to why that 1866 date is there. Ah, my sister just got her copy of the book. Is it heavy? Because it was surprisingly heavy to me. Um, let's see here. Yes, and Patreon is where I will actually have the audiobook probably first. I've actually put my Kentucky book out there as well, for the audiobook version. It's going to come off of Amazon at some point in the near future, and I will maybe have it on Audible / Amazon, Apple Books, all of those that I'm in negotiation on right now. So we will see how that goes. But yeah, I will just stay up with the channel and or join on Patreon, and I'll make a note when we come out with the audiobook. All right. So anyway, this story here is what kills me, because everything we know about Jack Daniel's history now was kind of written in this article. I mean, they sort of just made it all up right here. And what's interesting is this talks about the story of Lincoln County's whiskeys, and yet it only talks about Jack Daniel's. And so no wonder we have no idea that there was ever a Tully and Eaton, or that there was a Middleton Fanning Jr., or there's a Alexander, G.W. Alexander. There's a lot of names. Henry Kelso. All these guys were Lincoln County distillers, and they were big. And Tully and Eaton was actually bigger than Jack Daniel's at this time, or well, not at this time, but was at the end of the century. So, they all were forgotten in here, which makes sense because this is paid for by Jack Daniel's. Why do they want to advertise their former competition? But it really is the sign of this is the end of Tennessee whiskey history and the beginning of Tennessee Jack Daniel's whiskey history, basically. So very, very interesting. So Todd, in terms of the Kentucky book, actually, you know what I'm going to do? I have started on the process today, and I am going to start putting out updates in online, actually, in the so if you bought the book and you have the code, you'll be able to see it there. But also for Patreon members, I'm going to be posting them into the paid sections of Patreon over the next few weeks and months as I get time to go through and get my notes together and write those. So yeah, it's a mind blower, Colleen, isn't it? How thick that book is. So make a good doorstop if you need one. But yeah, no, I feel like I've been neglecting on the Kentucky book and trying to get a new version out there, because there's a lot of distilleries that really I've gone to and haven't written anything about yet, and also some new ones coming online. But I think it's going to be a little while before I actually can get something back to press. So just look for the updates. If you have bought the book and you have that code, then go out. You'll start to see in the newsletter, actually, as I start posting the new updates to the profiles that are out there. So we'll plug for the Kentucky book, which is still selling great, and definitely a lot of bourbon fans out there. Hopefully we'll get some people on the Tennessee Trail here coming up soon with this. Now, this was something else that I found absolutely hilarious as I was doing my research. after Prohibition kicks in, all of a sudden you have locker clubs and soft drink stands opening up. And so basically what they were doing was it was just this bit of subterfuge saying, okay, well, we have this soft drink stand, but we have a liquor license. So they're calling it a soft drink stand, and they're not supposed to be selling, but they're not calling themselves a saloon. So they're sort of trying to find a creative way around it. And the thing is that everybody knows what they're doing, yet nobody's enforcing the law. So, and then when they do try to enforce the law, then somewhere in the chain of things, it breaks down because not everybody wants to enforce the law. So there are these little chinks in the government that end up tossing these cases out as they go. So, yeah, I'm having a drink at the soft drink stand tonight. That kind of thing. Another interesting thing that I found just 3 weeks ago, and again, this one I was talking to the Metro Library in Nashville because they have all the Davidson County old records. And there's a really interesting story about George Dickel's first partner, Meyer Saltzgatter, during the war. And he is a very interesting individual. He's been covered in some other, he's covered in the Blood and Whiskey book by Peter Crass that's about Jack Daniels. And he takes a very negative approach to the George Dickel story. And so he kind of makes Meyer and Dickel's other partner, Manny Schwab, out to be villains, which they're not. And I go into the entire story of how basically Meyer Saltzgatter ends up in a federal prison in Illinois during the war because he's trading goods across the line to the Confederates. And so what was interesting is that I was looking for his divorce papers because there's a very interesting story. There was a case where he goes through a divorce, Meyer Saltzgatter, and I wanted to be able to see if I could find the clarify everything because I had read some stuff about it and I'm like, I want to read it for myself. Well, it was very detailed actually. And so, and in fact, the woman sent it back to me and she said, this is scandalous from the library. I laughed when I read that because it really is. And as I'm reading through it, the witness, one of the witnesses that was called on Meyer Saltzgatter's behalf was Adolph Nelson. And I saw that name and I went, oh, isn't that interesting? So here is the ad for Nelson and Company. This is when, during the war, Charles Nelson came to Tennessee and he opened up his first store, and it was a grocery. And so he opens up his grocery with this guy named Pfeiffer, who ends up going into the beer business after this. And so he's got his partner from Cincinnati, Blursch, and his brother, Adolph Nelson. And so basically, very interesting to note that I had been asked by the Nelson brothers whether there was a connection, whether I knew of whenever George Dickel had ever maybe met or whether there were any times they were together, Nelson and Dickel. Well, they were right down the street from each other, so they probably knew each other that way. But Adolf was actually in a German citizens group. And now, come to find out, just 3 weeks ago, that he actually was witness on behalf of Meyer Saltzgatter, who was the partner of George Dickel. So that kind of shows that connection as well. And this is something that Kentucky bourbon fans will find very interesting. I bumped into this article, and I did not mention the specific distilleries in here, but I was trying to find out why did Brown-Forman buy Jack Daniels? So this is from 1956, April 1956. Whiskey firms plan to leave state. So Barton Distilling Company, they're basically saying, you know, we're leaving Bardstown. We're going to move out of the state of Kentucky within the next few months. Glenmore Distillery says almost undoubtedly leaving the state. Why are they leaving the state? Brown-Forman, so this is where I bump into this, on the heels of the prediction that Brown-Forman is going to, or has said that Tennessee or Kentucky is going to lose all of its distilleries. And why are they going to lose all their distilleries? Because basically what they did was Tennessee or Kentucky was one of the only states after, in fact, they were the only state after Prohibition, as far as I know, that actually put a 5-cent tax per gallon on every gallon of whiskey that was either shipped into the state or that was produced in the state. And all of a sudden, the legislature comes out and says, we want to raise it to 20 cents. So we're talking about, 300% increase in the price. And so all of a sudden, all of these distillers are going, we will just leave Kentucky. There's no way we're hanging around and paying this much tax. So they started looking to hedge their bets. And that's what Brown-Forman was doing when they bought the Jack Daniel's distillery. They were saying, hey, we need to have another option just in case. And so I thought that was absolutely fascinating because I've talked to the people of Brown-Forman, I have talked to Jack Daniels, and nobody has really ever mentioned this. And so it was just something I stumbled into, but thought it was really interesting to see that. And so it was around this time also that George Dickel ends up starting to look back at Tennessee. But Shinley, who owned George Dickel at that time, basically was saying, we're making enough money in Kentucky. We don't need to go to Tennessee for that. So interesting piece of history there. Now, this is Josephine Brown. I do a chapter on the women in whiskey, and it's in Tennessee whiskey. And it's really interesting because there were 3 women that owned distilleries in Tennessee in the 1890s and first decade of the 1900s. And the one person I could find information on from her whiskey past was through a law case. Basically, I had to go through testimony to be able to get her history, which was fascinating. And I do cover her in the book. Her name is Nancy Patterson. And then there was Josephine Brown, who actually also owned a distillery, the J.S. Brown Distillery, and or the War Trace Distillery it was called. And she ran it for 20 years, actually. And so she doesn't get mentioned much because nobody remembers Robertson County whiskey history. But that she and Louisa Nelson were Robertson County's last 2 distillery owners, and they were both female. So really interesting story there as well. And it was interesting because I just went back to Robertson County, and the War Trace Distillery's offices still exist. It's a little cabin. And I was like, I want to go see it. So I went to the park, and they were setting up Christmas decorations. So they were like, we can't let you in. It's like, I came all the way from South Carolina. You're not going to let me go. So I took a picture of it from afar. But anyway, it's interesting because you'll see this cabin sitting in this city park, and you'll be like, why is that there? Well, it was built in 1796, but it actually ended up getting used as the distillery offices for the War Trace Distillery, which was around in the 1880s and all the way up to the end of Prohibition. And Todd, this one is the one for you. Crow's Whiskey. So what I love about this is from the Vicksburg Weekly Sentinel from January 6th, 1846. And I use this in the book to demonstrate branding and how branding changed, because you'll notice there's an apostrophe showing possession there, Crow's Whiskey, meaning that they just received from Kentucky from Dr. Crow himself, which he wasn't a doctor. I've learned since or recently, but I still call him that by habit. Mr. Crow had actually made this whiskey, and it was sent down, and it shows the possessive, whereas about 8 years later, you'll see it just called Crow Whiskey, not Old Crow, because old was only really thrown on there if you're designating the age of the whiskey or trying to say that it was a long-aged whiskey. So it was really interesting to run across this and see how that name kind of evolved over time. So I hope you enjoyed that. It was a little run through some of my research there. Um, Doctorate in engineering. You know what's funny about the Crow story, and I'm going to try to dive into it a little bit deeper, is that he's apparently graduated from the University of Edinburgh, but yet the University of Edinburgh doesn't have any records on him. So um, I don't know. Is this one just really big fabrication, or did he really go to the University of Edinburgh? I feel like that's one of those that I'm just going to have to dig into the records there also and see what I can find. And maybe we never find anything. Maybe we do. Um, but he is an interesting character and somebody that definitely needs to be covered more in depth. And I had heard that somebody was writing a full biography of him, but I haven't seen it yet. So yeah, it's absolutely crazy. So um, anyway, fun stuff there. Uh, it has been a journey. I started this journey 2.5 years ago with just casually looking up little bits of history, and then I got more serious about it after I talked with Heath Clark. He and I were there was some kind of Elon Musk was firing off a rocket or something that day, and I remember that because he was like, "Let's go outside and see if we can see the rocket." Then he realized after that it was an hour off because he had seen the Eastern time and we were in Central time, so we missed it. But it marked it in my mind, so I can always go back and look and see when that launch was to go. Oh, okay, that was the day that I finally said yes, I'm going to write this book. I know it was in October of last year, I think was when it was that I was like, yes, okay, I've got the information now. I need to really dig in and do this, and it has been fun, maddening, tense. I've stressed a bit over it at times because it was supposed to be written and finished by June, and then it was July, and then it was August, and now I finally have gotten to a point where the book is done and out there and available for you to buy. So it is on Amazon right now, and that's the only place it is. It will eventually be in stores. It should be in distilleries as well. I can't imagine. This is the thing I'm really looking forward to is walking into a Tennessee distillery, doing a tour, and hearing a bit of the history that I found, instead of the Jack Daniels history that is being told right now at every distillery across the state of Tennessee. So it will be fun to kind of watch that evolution and see the narrative change because some of the stuff that I covered in this book, some of it is Tennessee specific. Some of it goes into why branding came about, where bottles came from, when they came around, talking about a big distillery shutdown that happened after the Civil War that I've never heard anybody talk about. And I go deep into detail on that. And so, and then Prohibition, really the difference between moonshiners in the 19th and 20th centuries, that was absolutely fascinating to me. I did not expect to see that much of a difference, but it really changed between 1910 and 1920. All of a sudden, the whole culture changed. And so I go deep into that. And then there's the great Jack Daniels milking case, and that's a interesting story in and of itself. And Lem Motlow gets into some big trouble. I cover that in a trial that goes. There's got two trials going on at the same time, and this is all during Prohibition. Meets George Remus, and so I kind of go into that as well. And so again, more fascinating stuff that I bumped in. And then I do go through the modern part, but you're going to be in the last chapter by the time you get to what happened over the last 20 years, because I think a lot of that has been covered. But I wanted to get to the heart of some of the main stuff that happened there, and especially the evolution of the law and how distilling came back. So, but I found some really interesting whiskeys along the way that nobody's probably ever heard of, but that were attempts to bring Tennessee whiskey back. That will be kind of interesting information for you as well. More stuff I just kind of stumbled into by going through archives and newspapers, and it's like, okay, well, this is interesting. Let me see where this goes. Follow a rabbit hole, and all of a sudden you've got a whole new story coming up. So I hope you guys enjoy the book. Any last questions, you can toss them out there. I will tell you that I am slowly edging off of social media. I will be still on Instagram. I will still be on Facebook, but I will be on them much less. I'm putting everything that I do from this point forward onto patreon.com/whiskeylore. A lot will be on the free end. So just think of that as my new social media. And then you don't have to fight the algorithm anymore. It'll be right there for you. So anyway, thank you, James, for that. And thank you, Colleen. Thank you. By the way, I want to mention this before I go, because I don't know if my Patreon members know this or not. Maybe they figured it out. Because I may have mentioned it in my Irish book. But, oh, and here, that's what I was looking for. Stop the screen share. Yes. All right. The Irish whiskey book, if you go through it, and I think same in the Kentucky book, you will see in the acknowledgments that I actually list out the people in the Patreon group. I did that in this book too. So when you get to the back to the acknowledgments, there's a shout out to everybody that is a paid member of and has been in there for a while in the Tennessee book as well. So I really appreciate everybody that supports the podcast and my work in doing the book and the rest. And so thank you so much. And cheers, Slan Java. More videos will be coming up here. And again, all my YouTube stuff will show up on Patreon as well, too. But that's the book. And I look forward to talking to you guys again down the road. Have yourself a great evening.